Nazism, right wing, left wing, something else? Today we want to react to a Megatron video that answers that question, or does it? Welcome to Into the Desert. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. So, I came across this video from Megatron and I thought it was really interesting because I know you talk about the spectrums of political ideologies in your book, Seeking Truth, and I would love to hear your reaction of Megatron's video and if you agree with him or not.
Okay, sounds good.
Was Nazism left-wing or right-wing? Well, believe it or not, this question gets asked around a lot, and there are several creators that provided answers. Well, the thing is that today's answer will be grounded on history and political science. But before we do that, let's talk about the question proper. This question is a form of ahistorical syllogism. You'll see several people giving you answers today in the comments down below. The same people will not watch this video and they will type either obviously was right-wing or of course it was left-wing.
There's a part of that that's true because Nazism was a historical movement, and so it will not map directly to right or left today. However, that kind of ignores that right and left wing are their philosophies that go back to the French Revolution and where they started and the division of the States General into the right side of the house and the left side of the house. Those things have continued up to today. So, yes, it's not going to map directly today, but it is part of a tradition that has roots going back to the beginning of the 19th century. So, yeah, it will be one or the other, although I have a slightly different take on Nazism opposed to fascism, but it's not quite as ahistorical as he's implying at this point.
In my opinion, there are two major problems here. One, they use the American left-right dichotomy or political spectrum and they forcefully apply it to historical European political regimes and ideologies. Hence, the first problem with the question proper is geographic or spatial in nature. Two, they use 21st century political spectra and juxtapose them over 20th century politics.
Yeah, it sounds like he's agreeing with you here too, is that we're trying to use our modern way.
He's not agreeing with me because I hadn't really stated that, but yeah, when you talk about right and left in the United States, and you talk about right and left in Europe, they are not the same thing. I have an editor who's in England, and we both agree there is no right wing per se in an American sense in Europe. Europe is pretty much universally. So when you think you're talking about right, left, you're talking about a spectrum and where that center of the spectrum changes from country to country to country. So the American right wing is not the same as the European right wing would be. It's just their right wing, for the most part, would be what we would consider centrist leftists here in the United States. So that's a very valid point.
Thus, the second problem is temporal. The incongruence between modern and 20th century political definitions within the right-left dichotomy is a complex phenomenon rooted in evolving socioeconomic shifting of global dynamics. Thus, this discrepancy necessitates of a nuanced analysis of the factors that contribute to this divergence. Within these dynamics, the correct and coherent answer is going to be fractal, as there is no clean definition overlap. History is a multidimensional phenomenon. Expecting, therefore, 21st century American political ideas to overlap neatly and perfectly with 20th century European political factions in order to come out with an answer is a flawed analytical method.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously true. However, it ignores that right and left are phenomenon that they go back to the beginning of the 19th century, a trace forward, and you can place movements. A leftist in the middle of the 1850s is not going to be the same as a leftist today. You couldn't even say a leftist in the sense of the 1950s would be a leftist today. These things are constantly changing, but they're like rivers. You can't say that the same river is going past the same point. However, there's a continuous flow. and then you can trace the traditions back to one side or the other.
But haven't we ever created definitions of what left and what right would be? Isn't there some sort of global definition?
There's multiple. It's actually one of the things I do in Seeking Truth is I look at how these movements, how the right and the left started, and how they trace forward. And yeah, there are distinguishing features that are true of leftists, regardless of pretty much what point in history they are, and they're same thing that could be true of those on the right. And there is a political spectrum. However, the individual issues will change based on what's going on in that particular country at that particular time. So, and then again, you have extremes because these are not individual movements, but they're phenomena, they're gathering of people, and there's going to be a spectrum. So even within the left, there's going to be a spectrum within the left, center left, extreme left, more moderate left, and same with the right. You have center right, extreme right, and more moderate right. So those two things overlap, and that's where we get the overall right-left spectrum. I'm not really disagreeing with him. It's just I'm a little suspicious because you can overanalyze something to the point that you're actually no longer saying anything. And I do think you can say something about right and left, and I do think Nazism has a particular position with some caveats on that spectrum.
Okay, let's see what he says.
So, the people who are categorically stating it was left-wing, it was right-wing, are not answering to present a comprehensive analysis of policies, ideologies, historical actions, military interventions, economic, religious and social positions pushed by said regimes. They are just insulting the other side. They are free to do it, of course, but just so we are clear about what those answers are. Make no mistake, Nazi is a slur, and so people want to use it to identify and describe their political opponents. That is why, I would argue, it works as a conduit to the detriment of your political opposition when it comes to mass and public opinion. In this framework, fascism and Hitler currently have negative valence, they are derogatory, and with that established, the following coarsely represents the train of thought leading to this usage.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. The vast majority of the time you hear people use the term Nazi, they're using it more to slur their opponents than they are to accurately describe something.
I would argue even that most people probably don't even know what Nazism is, and they just see it as, well, you're just being a Hitler.
Yeah.
And even that, I don't think people really understand everything that Hitler did. They just know that he killed 6 million Jews, not all of the political and economic changes that he did in Germany and for the war.
They don't understand what was it that caused people like Mussolini to create fascism, why it was created, how they created it, why Hitler adopted it, and all they know is Hitler, concentration camps, Holocaust, bad, and therefore my opponents must be bad, therefore I will call my opponents Nazis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nazism, bad, opponent. It's as simple as that, right?
For a lot of people, it's pretty much that's what it is. And in that sense, I would agree with him. Interested to still see where he ends up, but at that point, I would agree with him.
Yeah.
Nazi bad. We all agree with that? Okay. You Nazi. You bad. It's a simple process, really. Clearly, it doesn't require any deep empirical analysis grounded on historical political science.
Exactly what we just said, right? Nazi bad, yes. You bad, therefore you Nazi. That is a logical fallacy, if I'm not mistaken, right?
There's several of them in there, but yes.
Yeah.
It's just sloppy thinking, and he is correct to point that out.
Which is one of the reasons why the media uses the word constantly. Yeah, who would have thought the media's full of shit? You see, once you take that leap, your historical vision will be irreversibly tainted. The question is flawed to begin with because its basis, namely the expectations and the prism of evaluation, are not in alignment. And on top of that, this has rendered the traditional unidimensional political spectrum increasingly inadequate for capturing the complexity of 20th century political parties. And all of this reflects the ongoing evolution of political taxonomy. So, What do we do now? Well, to answer this correctly, first, we need to ensure objectivity to our analysis. Focus on attitudes towards private property, individual freedom, and wealth redistribution patterns. If needed, even implementing a mathematical apparatus. Also, we should explore and take into consideration the political allegiances that occurred historically and the sort of opposition to the regime in question, the Nazis. So let's do that. Welcome to our comprehensive qualitative analysis. Some people will use nomenclature as a gotcha moment to place the Nazis within the political spectrum. In other words, Nazism stands for National Socialism, so they were socialists, hence left-wing. Now, nomenclature alone cannot be used as the basis for classification. It's too shallow and unscientific as a parameter. This is regardless of whether you think they were left-wing or right-wing. Let me prove it to you. If the name of any given party is the basis of the argument of where they stand within the left-right dichotomy, then is the Communist Party in China Republican in the American sense? I mean, it's the People's Republic of China. Similarly, is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, aka North Korea, really democratic? Yeah, didn't think so. And if you really want to break your brain, I made a video not too long ago talking about ancient democracies, such as, for example, Greek democracy, which was a form of pure democracy, and then I compared it to modern democracies and to see what they differed and what areas they had in common. Well, in the comment section of that video, as it happens, my American viewers began a flame war whereby you had people saying, no, America is a democracy, and other people saying, no, America is a constitutional republic.
Yeah, that's something I address in preserving democracy, because actually both sides are right, because America is a republic. It's not a democratic government in the sense that Athens was. But a republic is still a form of democracy. It's a form of democratic government. What they're usually referring to there is direct democracy or popular democracy. And again, it's just sloppy thinking when people make that argument. And I take somewhat disagreement in the sense that, yeah, you cannot simply go to the name and assume that it is what it is. However, it's one thing for example, communist China to look at popular terms and label their government with popular terms. It's something different when you have a movement that is creating something new, describing their new form in terms that they think are positive. The people who created fascism were socialists, looking for a solution to a problem with socialism. One of the problems coming out of World War I was that Marx had said the workers of the world will rise up and defeat the rulers. Well, that didn't happen. Workers of the world were fighting each other during World War I. And so to try and address why the workers would fight for the people that was supposedly oppressing them, they changed socialism to come up with a new form of socialism that was centered around the nation as opposed to the world. Marx's saying was workers of the world unite. Well, that wasn't working. So they came up with a new form of socialism centered around the nation, but they called it a national socialism. When Hitler or Mussolini picked National Socialism, they weren't trying to take positive terms from someplace else and slap it on their form of government. They were taking what they saw as positive terms that they agreed with and reshaping and modifying them to represent their new form of government. So National Socialism was a new phenomenon. It was a modification of traditional socialism. And so, yeah, you can point to them. It's not conclusive by any means, but it is instructive as to where fascism came from.
But back to what we were talking about originally is the American form of government. When you're arguing between are we a democracy or are we a republic, we can be both, because a republic is a type of democracy that was, again, designed to fix the flaws of a direct democracy, whereas the Nazi National Socialism Party was designed to fix the flaws that they saw in socialism. So it is, in that sense, it's a nice comparison, right?
Yeah, I mean, Nazism is an abbreviation of Nationalsozialismus. you take that and shorten it, you get Nazi, right? That's where we get the actual label Nazi. It comes from the German Nationalsozialismus.
All right, let's see what else he says.
Right. Well, do you know what Italy is? Well, after the referendum of the 2nd of June 1946, Italy abolished monarchy and became officially, wait for it, una repubblica democratica. That translates as a democratic republic. Yeah, welcome to Europe. You think that's confusing? Well, in the United States, simple liberalism often means social liberalism, and a liberal is a left-winger. But in Europe, simple liberalism often means classical liberalism, which can be a center-right position, particularly for those right-wing populist movements that embrace economic policies which in America will be associated with the left.
What are your thoughts on this diagram? From a left-right wing perspective, it seems similar to what you were talking about earlier.
Well, what do you mean? What do the terms actually mean? So if you look at a radical, well, please define radical. And what is a reactionary? Please define reactionary. And, it's like Aristotle said, thousands of years ago, how many arguments would be deflated into but a single paragraph if people would dare define their terms? And so that's what happens with a lot of these is we throw these terms out. Some of them are historical and their meanings have changed. So what you just said about classical liberalism is completely true, right? In many respects, we're all leftists today because nobody supports the monarchy, at least in the United States or Europe. And they have a monarchy like in England that they support, and not supporting it with the divine right of kings to rule absolutely. That would have been true, a couple hundred years ago. So in many respects, these are movements that change through history, but they do have distinctive features. A distinctive feature of the right is a emphasis on the individual and the emphasis on liberty. A distinctive feature of the left is the emphasis on the group and the emphasis on equality. And all of those are very good, positive terms. And when you meet in the center, a lot of people find a lot of agreement on that. But as you begin to move out on the spectrum in each way, liberal versus conservative, that begins to change. And people on one side or the other will begin to emphasize liberty or equality. You can't have both. Those are actually mutually exclusive terms. The more you have of the one, the less you will have of the other. You either enter into a compromise that allows the maximization of both, or you focus on one over the expense of the other. And that's where you end up with left and right. The left supports the group, and they support equality among groups, and the right supports the individuals. So when you go to the far left, you end up with very large governments with either close to or at totalitarian, because that's the only way you can support equality is by suppressing liberty. And if you go to the far right, you end up with not Nazism, but you end up with basically anarchy, where there is no government because nobody will recognize any government over them. They want complete liberty to do whatever they want to do. And that's where the two extremes end up. Then you can ask, where does National Socialism end up on that spectrum? Again, a lot of this is how do you define your terms? And granted, the terms are going to be defined differently and looked at differently on the spectrum in Europe than they are in the United States. The United States has much more of a right wing. It, often gets labeled Nazi, which it isn't, because Nazis were totalitarians. In the news over here, one of the recent controversies was that it was a weaponization of free speech that caused the Holocaust. That was silly. That just can't. That is so completely ahistorical. The idea that the Nazis were out promoting free speech to the point that it allowed for the Holocaust is just absurd. But that's the silly sort of rhetoric you get into when you think of your opponents are bad, Nazis are bad, therefore Nazis are terrible. Frankly, I don't think we ever need to refer to our opponents as communists or Nazis unless they actually are, and they really aren't, at least within the political spectrum of the United States. So that's the sort of thing, yeah, they may be in that tradition, but so what? I mean, both sides of the spectrum end up in disaster. The right ends up in chaos and breakdown of civilization because everybody doesn't respect the laws above them. The left ends up in totalitarianism. Fine. Let's try and stay towards the center where virtually 99% of the public is anyway, and talk about what we actually believe in,
while at the same time promoting cultural and social conservatism. And on that note, since we're talking about what a party named itself, do you want to know what Hitler said when it comes to left or right? Well, Hitler denied that Nazism was either left-wing or right-wing. Instead, he officially portrayed Nazism as a, open quotes, syncretic movement. Yeah, let's ditch the whole name argument, shall we? So what do I propose as an alternative? Well, personally, I think that the best way to define Nazism is a totalitarian dictatorship. That's going to be our basic core definition to identify what we are talking about, instead of using the American left-right spectrum. Then, after having established firmly what Nazism is, we can then look at the policies one by one and decide from an American contemporary perspective which of these lean right and which lean left, based on their salience. Alright, that sounds good on paper, but let's try if it works. What defines totalitarianism? Centralized authority, strength in the military, militarism with resources directed to domestic population, authoritarianism and dictatorial rule, repression of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, systematic elimination of political opposition by violence, expansionistic foreign policies, and conquest through military might. Already note that all three historical totalitarian regimes of the 20th century fit very neatly within this box: German Nazism, Italian fascism, and Soviet communism. In other words, when we examine the practical manifestations of these 20th century regimes, striking similarities emerge. For instance, the lack of individualism and individual freedom. Benito Mussolini himself publicly stated that fascism is anti-individualistic and accepts the individual only in as far as the interests coincide with those of the state. Well, yeah, but then again, communism, fascism, and Nazism might be considered quite different when it comes to their core ideology, so Metatron, are you really sure that they would fit each and every single one of these? Okay, let me prove it to you. Number one, centralized authority. Absolutely, all three. Strength in the military. Do I even need to comment that? Militarism with resources directed to domestic population. Well, in the case of the Nazi, of course, that meant the Jews, and it meant gypsies and every single person that opposed the Nazi regime. But when it comes to Stalin, well, he murdered more of his own people than he did of his foreign enemies. Just putting it out there. Authoritarianism and dictatorial rule, repression of freedom of speech. But what about the freedom of speech part? And I was sure, well, let me prove it to you. Let's do a little thought exercise. You are in 1940s Germany. You disagree with Adolf Hitler's opinions, so you go to Berlin, and in front of the whatever government building that they have there, you say, Hitler was an idiot. Yeah. Do you think you're going to survive that? And into the concentration camps you go.
Yeah, and I have a great-grandfather who was in the concentration camps for that reason. He disagreed with Hitler, and he had a number, and he was not Jew. He was a German, and he loved his country, but he disagreed with Hitler, and he was put in a concentration camp for it.
This kind of makes my point, and, he's correct. There was a government that promoted the individual and promoted freedom. It was a totalitarian government. One little quibble, and I write about this in my book, one little quibble is, I would argue, and I think he might even agree, that Nazism doesn't even really fit on the political spectrum. I think Hitler probably, and Nazism probably is more closely to organized crime and crime bosses. I mean, Hitler had his purge, the Night of the Long Knives, where he killed all his opponents within his own party. Yep. So in that sense, I don't think they fit on the political spectrum at all. If they do, they're part of fascism and would be part of the totalitarian left. But again, the idea that you have a spectrum and that a spectrum has many points along the way of the spectrum doesn't mean that if someone's on that spectrum, they're automatically at the very extreme.
No, completely agree.
Well, we're about halfway through the video at this point. It's an interesting video. There's a lot that I agree with him. I encourage you to, if you've not seen the whole video, we'll put the link down below. I encourage you to watch the whole video, think about what he's saying, and comment. I mean, you have any comments? You agree with him? You agree with me? You disagree with both of us? You have some other opinions on whether Nazism is right, left, or whatever. Add them to the comments. And I hope you enjoyed this. Again, I encourage you to watch his full video. It's well worth thinking about and looking at ways that we can actually learn to talk to one another and moderate our feelings and our opinions. Number one, define your terms. It help tremendously, as he's doing here, is go into deep definitions. Because once you do that, you understand that much of what we argue about, we actually don't even need to argue about if we just define our terms. Anyway, thank you for watching. Be sure to comment below, like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.